Here's something most people with high blood sugar or insulin resistance are never told. The problem almost certainly isn't how much you're eating. It's how your body is processing what you eat, and those are two completely different problems with two completely different solutions. Because here's what happens when someone gets a high fasting blood glucose result. Their doctor tells them to eat less, move more, maybe cut carbs. And some people do all of that, diligently, for months, and their numbers barely move. And they blame themselves. They think they don't have enough discipline. But the real issue is that nobody explained to them that blood sugar regulation is not just about quantity. It's about timing, sequencing, food structure, meal composition, and the specific way your body's digestive system handles different types of food. There are at least 9 distinct levers completely independent of total calorie intake that directly control how high your blood sugar rises after a meal. And most people are unknowingly pulling all of them in the wrong direction. Today I'm going to walk you through every single one, with the research behind each one, so you understand not just what to do, but exactly why it works. Before we get into the strategies, I want to make sure we're all working from the same understanding of what's actually happening in the body, because this changes everything about how you approach the solutions. Insulin is a hormone produced by the pancreas, and its primary job is to act like a key. When glucose from food enters your bloodstream, insulin unlocks the doors on your muscle cells, liver cells, and fat cells so that glucose can enter and be used for energy or stored. In a healthy metabolic state, this system is exquisitely sensitive. A small amount of insulin opens a lot of doors very efficiently. Insulin resistance means those locks have become stiff. The key doesn't turn as easily. So the pancreas responds the only way it knows how, by producing more keys, more insulin. And for a while, that works. Blood glucose stays controlled, but only because the pancreas is working overtime to compensate. The problem is that chronically elevated insulin has consequences of its own. It promotes fat storage, it drives inflammation, and over time, the pancreas begins to exhaust itself. Eventually, blood glucose starts rising even with excess insulin. That is type 2 diabetes in its full expression. Now, here's the critical insight. Every one of the 9 strategies I'm about to show you works by reducing the glucose load that enters the bloodstream after a meal, which means the insulin system doesn't have to work as hard. You're reducing the demand on a system that's already been strained. And you can start doing this today, regardless of what you ate yesterday. Strategy 1. Understand what you're actually eating when you eat carbohydrates. All carbohydrates, bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, fruit, are ultimately chains of glucose molecules. When you eat them, your digestive system breaks those chains apart, and individual glucose molecules enter your bloodstream. This is not a flaw in your metabolism. This is exactly what carbohydrates are designed to do. The question is not whether glucose enters your blood. It always will when you eat carbohydrates. The question is how fast, how high, and for how long. And that answer depends almost entirely on how the food was processed before it reached your plate. A whole grain of wheat contains glucose, yes, but it's locked inside a physical structure of fiber, protein, and fat that your digestive system has to physically break down before it can access that glucose. That takes time. That slows absorption. That means a lower, more gradual blood sugar rise. Now take that same wheat grain, strip out the fiber, strip out the protein, strip out the fat, and grind what's left into flour fine enough to feel like talcum powder. And now that glucose is essentially pre-digested. Your intestine absorbs it almost instantly. Same food, completely different metabolic outcome. This is what researchers call the food matrix effect, and it is one of the most underappreciated concepts in nutritional science. Strategy 2. Choose foods with a lower glycemic load, not just a lower glycemic index. The glycemic index tells you how fast a food raises blood sugar, but the glycemic load also accounts for how much of that food you're actually eating. Watermelon, for example, has a high glycemic index, but a typical serving has so little carbohydrate by weight that its glycemic load is actually quite low. What you want to prioritize in practice are foods that are minimally processed, higher in fiber, and lower in refined starch, whole legumes, most vegetables, most whole intact grains. Not because carbohydrates are dangerous, but because the structure of those foods slows the rate at which glucose enters your system, and rate is everything. Strategy 3. Add resistant starch to your meals and understand how to create it. Resistant starch is a type of carbohydrate that your small intestine cannot digest. It passes through largely intact, feeds beneficial gut bacteria, and does not raise blood glucose the way regular starch does. Here's the remarkable part. You can create resistant starch from foods that would otherwise spike your blood sugar significantly simply by cooking them and then cooling them before eating. When cooked rice or cooked pasta cools overnight in the refrigerator, a portion of its digestible starch physically transforms into resistant starch through a process called retrogradation. Studies have shown that cooled, reheated rice raises blood glucose significantly less than freshly cooked rice with the same total calories and the same total carbohydrate content. The food itself changed its metabolic behavior based on temperature. For practical application, cook rice the night before, refrigerate it, reheat gently the next day. That simple step converts a meaningful portion of digestible starch to resistant starch and measurably lowers its blood sugar impact. Strategy 4. Never eat carbohydrates alone. The naked carb problem. When you eat a carbohydrate by itself, a slice of bread on an empty stomach, crackers as a snack, a bowl of rice with nothing else, your digestive system processes it almost entirely as glucose, with very little competing for absorption priority. Now add protein, fat, or fiber to that same carbohydrate. Something changes fundamentally. Fat slows the rate at which your stomach empties its contents into the small intestine, the process called gastric emptying. Slower gastric emptying means glucose enters the bloodstream more gradually. Protein triggers the release of hormones that also slow gastric emptying. Fiber physically forms a gel-like barrier in the intestine that slows glucose absorption at the cellular level. Research comparing bread eaten alone versus bread eaten with butter or olive oil has shown a drop in glycemic index of nearly 1/3 just from adding fat to the same food. A 1/3 reduction from a condiment. This is why traditional food cultures that eat bread with olive oil or rice with legumes and vegetables have historically had lower rates of metabolic disease than those who adopted refined, carbohydrate-alone eating patterns. Strategy 5. Eat your carbohydrates last in the meal, the sequencing strategy. This one consistently surprises people because it seems too simple to matter. But the physiology makes it completely logical once you understand what the stomach is actually doing. Your stomach is not just a passive container. It's a dynamic mixing chamber with a gatekeeper function. It holds food and releases it into the small intestine in measured pulses, controlling the rate of absorption. When you eat carbohydrates first on an empty stomach, the stomach releases them into the small intestine rapidly, because there's nothing else in there to slow the process. The blood glucose rise is steep and fast. But when you eat protein and vegetables first, by the time you get to your carbohydrates, the stomach already contains a mixture of food. The carbohydrates become part of that mixed bolus. The gastric emptying rate is already slowed by the protein and fat already present. Clinical trials comparing the exact same meal eaten in different sequences have shown reductions in post-meal blood glucose of 30 to 40% simply by eating vegetables and protein first and carbohydrates last. Same total food, same total calories, same total carbohydrates, just different order. The practical rule: salad and protein first, bread or rice last. Strategy 6. Use acids, vinegar, lemon juice, fermented foods to blunt glucose spikes. This is one of the most elegant and underused dietary tools available. Organic acids, acetic acid in vinegar, citric acid in lemon juice, lactic acid in fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, and yogurt, have a direct effect on carbohydrate digestion. The enzyme responsible for breaking down starch into individual glucose molecules begins working in your mouth. Saliva contains amylase, and amylase starts cleaving those glucose chains the moment food touches your tongue. Acid inactivates amylase. When you add vinegar or lemon to a meal, You're partially disabling the first digestive enzyme in the chain, which means less starch is broken down before it even reaches your stomach. Less pre-digested starch means less glucose available for rapid absorption in the small intestine. Studies have shown that having 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar before or with a meal can reduce post-meal blood glucose by 20% or more in people with insulin resistance. The traditional habit of dressing salad with olive oil and vinegar before the main course isn't just culinary tradition, it's accidental metabolic medicine. Strategy 7. Walk within 20 to 30 minutes of finishing a meal. Your skeletal muscles are the largest glucose-consuming tissue in your body. At rest, they're relatively passive consumers. They take up some glucose, but not urgently. The moment they start contracting, their glucose demand increases dramatically. And here's the key. They can take up glucose from the bloodstream independently of insulin during exercise. That means that even in a state of insulin resistance, where the normal insulin-driven glucose uptake is impaired, muscle contraction opens a parallel, insulin-independent pathway for glucose clearance. A 10 to 15-minute walk after a meal, not a strenuous workout, just walking, has been shown in multiple studies to reduce post-meal blood glucose by a clinically meaningful amount. The timing matters. The glucose from your meal peaks in the bloodstream approximately 60 to 90 minutes after eating. Walking during that window, not before, not 3 hours later, intercepts that glucose peak and redirects it into muscle tissue that's actively contracting and burning it. You are essentially diverting the flood before it builds pressure. Even light activity like standing at a counter or doing slow household tasks in the 30 minutes after a meal produces a measurable benefit compared to sitting completely still. Strategy 8. Eat your larger carbohydrate portions earlier in the day. Your body's insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm. It is not constant throughout the day. Research consistently shows that the same glucose load produces a significantly higher blood sugar response in the evening than it does in the morning. The underlying mechanism involves the interplay between cortisol, which enhances insulin sensitivity and peaks in the morning, and melatonin, which begins rising in the evening and actually suppresses insulin secretion. Your pancreas is simply less responsive to the need for insulin at night, and your cells are less sensitive to the insulin that is produced. A meal eaten at 7 p.m. produces a meaningfully higher and more prolonged blood glucose rise than the identical meal eaten at 7 a.m. The practical implication: front-load your carbohydrate-containing foods earlier in the day when your metabolic machinery is primed to handle them, and make your evening meals progressively lower in starchy carbohydrates. This is not intermittent fasting, it's metabolic timing, working with your biology rather than against it. Strategy 9. Protect your sleep, because one bad night measurably damages your glucose metabolism. This is the one most people never connect to blood sugar, and it may be the most powerful of all 9 strategies in terms of how quickly its effects manifest. A single night of poor sleep, not chronic sleep deprivation, just one night, reduces insulin sensitivity in healthy adults by 25% the following day. This has been demonstrated repeatedly in controlled sleep studies going back decades. The mechanism involves elevated cortisol from poor sleep driving gluconeogenesis, the liver releasing glucose into the bloodstream even without food intake, and simultaneously reducing the sensitivity of muscle and fat cells to insulin signals. The result is that the same meal you ate yesterday, without any significant blood sugar impact, will spike your glucose significantly higher today if you slept poorly last night. This also explains why people with chronically poor sleep have dramatically higher rates of type 2 diabetes, independent of diet and exercise habits. Protecting sleep is not a lifestyle luxury. For metabolic health, it is a primary intervention. 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep in a cool, dark room with consistent sleep and wake times is as powerful a metabolic tool as any dietary change on this list. So let's bring all 9 of this together, because what I want you to see is the pattern underneath all of them. Every single strategy on this list works by doing one of 3 things: slowing the rate at which glucose enters the bloodstream, improving the efficiency with which your cells clear that glucose, or reducing the total demand on an already strained insulin system. None of them require you to eat dramatically less. None of them require expensive supplements or medications. They require understanding how your body actually processes food and then making deliberate choices that work with that biology rather than against it. The 9 strategies in order: 1. Understand the food matrix and choose less processed carbohydrates. 2. Prioritize lower glycemic load foods in your daily eating. 3. Use resistant starch by cooking and cooling rice, pasta, and legumes before eating. 4. Never eat carbohydrates naked. Always pair them with fat, protein, or fiber. 5. Eat your carbohydrates last in every meal. 6. Add vinegar or acidic foods to your meals regularly. 7. Walk for 10 to 15 minutes within 30 minutes of finishing eating. 8. Eat your largest carbohydrate portions in the morning and early afternoon, not the evening. And 9. Protect your sleep as aggressively as you protect any other aspect of your health, because one bad night undoes a week of good eating decisions. If you're managing blood sugar, prediabetes, or type 2 diabetes, none of these strategies replace the guidance of your physician, but every one of them is supported by peer-reviewed research and can be implemented starting today without any prescription, without any cost, and without any drastic dietary overhaul. These are adjustments to how and when you eat, not radical restrictions of what you're allowed to eat. And for most people, stacking even 3 or 4 of these together produces a meaningful, measurable difference in their post-meal glucose numbers within days.